This episode was made possible by Podgo. Podgo is the easiest way for you to begin monetizing your podcast, whether you're big or small. Podgo provides podcasters with a flat rate for ad space, so you always know how much you get when you include an ad from Podgo. I recently joined as a member, and you can too. Apply today at podgo.co to become a member and immediately be connected with advertisers that fit your audience. That's podgo.co. Warning: this episode contains description that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is strongly advised. Hi guys, just to let you know that I have a promo of another podcast that I would love for you to listen to, playing at the very end of this episode, so please stay tuned until then. Hi M&Ms, welcome back to another episode of Murder and More. As always, I am your host, Kira. Singapore was considered one of the British Empire's most impenetrable islands, which is why the fall of Singapore is described as one of the British Army's biggest defeats, and by far the worst defeat it suffered during World War II. The Battle of Singapore began on the 8th of February 1942, when Japan, who were experienced in combat after several battles, invaded Singapore. The battle, which was fought fast and violently by Japan, took place over a 7-day period, resulting in roughly 10,000 casualties, anywhere between 80,000 and 100,000 troops becoming prisoners of war, and eventually the surrender of Singapore. Whilst the Japanese and the British Army were fighting for occupation of Singapore, police in Britain were fighting a battle of their own, attempting to identify a brutal killer before he had the chance to claim any more women's lives. On the cold morning of Monday the 9th of February 1942, an electrician on his way to work discovered the body of 40-year-old Evelyn Hamilton in a street-level air raid shelter in the West End area of London. Evelyn, who worked as a pharmacist, had been strangled, and her handbag, which contained approximately £80, had been stolen. However, some of its contents had been strewn about the pavement outside of the shelter. Her empty handbag was later found by a police officer on a nearby street. The stealing of her handbag and the lack of injuries to Evelyn's body led police to suspect she may have been the victim of a mugging. Evelyn's body was identified by her landlady, Catherine Jones, the following day. Evelyn Hamilton, who was one of 4 girls, was born on the 8th of February 1901. She had graduated from the University of Edinburgh with a degree in chemistry and pharmacology at 22 years old. Soon after, she relocated from the northeast of England to Essex to work in a chemist. It was known that in the days prior to her murder, Evelyn had quit her job managing a chemist and informed a friend of her plans to leave London for a managerial role at a pharmacy in Lincolnshire. She was described as a lonely person with no romantic partners and no evidence of a social life, with her boss describing her as eccentric. Evelyn was last seen by a waitress at the Maison Lyon corner house shortly before midnight, celebrating her 41st birthday. The location of Evelyn's body led police to conclude that she had been attacked as she walked back to her boarding house in the early hours of the morning, and a post-mortem revealed she had been strangled by an individual who was left-handed. Just the following morning, on Tuesday the 10th, 35-year-old Evelyn Oatley, who was also known as Nita Ward, was found naked and murdered in her flat by 2 meter readers. Her head hung over the side of the bed, and blood saturated the floor. Evelyn, who worked as a sex worker, had injuries so horrific they shocked even the seasoned of detectives. She had been beaten, strangled, and had her throat cut, severing her carotid artery. Evelyn was then physically and sexually mutilated with a tin opener, an electric torch, curling tongs, and a razor blade. Fingerprints were found on the blood-stained tin opener, however these did not match any convicted criminals. Evelyn Oatley was born as Evelyn Judd on the 5th of April 1907 in Lancashire. She had long dreamed of moving to London and pursuing her dream of entertainment, and became a singer, dancer and actor. When Evelyn was 15, she fell pregnant, with the baby being adopted by a Canadian couple. Evelyn had turned to sex work at the beginning of the war to supplement her income from her job as a nightclub hostess, after failing to make it on the stage in West London. It's also believed that Evelyn preferred to spend the night with an older man, as she didn't like being alone, as the air raid sirens wailed in the pitch black. She had a rule: she would only go with older men, as she found them to be less violent, however had relaxed her rule that evening. 3 eyewitnesses informed police that Evelyn had been approached by a young, clean-shaven man with chestnut brown hair outside a restaurant the evening before her murder. She was last seen by Ivy Poole, who lived in the same building, entering the property with the man at approximately 11:40 p.m. Her estranged husband, a poultry farmer called Harold Oakley, who lived in Liverpool at the time, identified her body. Due to the lack of mutilation to Evelyn Hamilton's body, at the time the 2 murders were not connected. 43-year-old, widowed mother of 1, Margaret Florence Lowe, was last seen by a neighbour at approximately 1:15 a.m. on the 11th of February, walking along the corridor to her flat in the company of a client. The neighbour then heard the client leave Margaret's flat later on, and heard him whistling to himself as he left the building. Margaret Campbell Burkitt was born in 1899 in New Zealand. The family emigrated to the UK when she was young and lived in cramped quarters in East London. When Margaret's father died during World War I, the family struggled financially, which saw Margaret forced to walk the streets to earn money. When Margaret's husband, Frederick Lowe, passed away in 1932, she returned to sex work in order to pay her daughter's boarding school fees. Margaret's body wasn't discovered until the 13th of February, when her 15-year-old daughter, Barbara, came over to visit her. Barbara got the train to visit her mother every 3rd weekend, and I'm sure wasn't prepared for the scene she was about to walk into. Having been told by a neighbour that Margaret hadn't been seen for several days, Barbara tentatively entered the flat her mother lived in. In the bed, under the covers that had been pulled up underneath her chin, was the lifeless body of Margaret Lowe. She had been beaten and strangled to death with a silk stocking, injuries that forensic pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who performed her autopsy, described as, quote, "quite dreadful," end quote. He went on to describe Margaret's killer as, quote, "a savage sexual maniac," end quote, who, quote, "indulged in a wicked lust to perpetrate the most diabolical injuries on the women he killed," end quote. Margaret's body had been extensively mutilated by several objects, including a razor blade, several knives, a poker, and she had been sexually mutilated with a candle. Margaret's abdomen had been cut, exposing her internal organs, and a 10-inch gaping wound was found on the right side of her groin. Fingerprints were discovered on several items at the crime scene, and evidence indicated that the perpetrator was left-handed. The injuries to Margaret's body and the evidence discovered at the scene led Sir Bernard Spilsbury to the conclusion that her murder had been carried out by the same individual who had savagely murdered Evelyn Oatley. 25-year-old Catherine Mulcahy was attacked in her flat by a client on the evening of Thursday the 12th. Catherine, who worked as a sex worker under the alias Kathleen King, met the client on Regent Street before taking him back to her flat. When Catherine had undressed and lay on the bed, the man removed his clothes, climbed on top of her, and shoved his knee into her stomach before attempting to strangle her, whilst using the weight of his body to pin her down to the bed. Catherine hadn't taken off her boots and managed to kick her attacker in the stomach, which caused him to fall onto the floor. With him off of her, Catherine ran from her flat to her neighbours, screaming at the top of her lungs. Her attacker, partially dressed, got his coat and abruptly left the flat. In doing so, unknowingly, the man, who Catherine described as having a strange smile on his face while he attacked her, left behind his RAF-issued belt. The attacker was not finished for the night, and after his brutal attack on Catherine, he crossed paths with 32-year-old Doris Jouannet. Doris, who was also known as Olga, was last seen by a friend at roughly 10:20 p.m. on the 12th at a corner house tea room. After parting ways with her friend, Beatrice Lang, Doris and the unknown attacker crossed paths, and she took him back to the flat she shared with her husband. Doris intermittently worked as a sex worker after marrying her husband, who had been a client in 1935, and was known to have told West End sex workers that she turned to the trade from time to time to supplement her husband's income. It's also believed she may have turned to sex work out of boredom. Doris's body was discovered the following evening, when her husband, Henry, returned home. The bedroom door had been locked, and after unsuccessfully attempting to pry it open, he phoned police. When Constable William Payne attended the flat, he pried the door open and witnessed Doris naked on the bed with a silk stocking around her neck. Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department were alerted, where Divisional Detective Leonard Clare noticed that Doris's jaw had been broken and she had been strangled to death with the silk stocking. At the autopsy, it was determined that Doris's breast and left thigh had been mutilated as she was dying. After her death, her killer mutilated her abdomen and genitals with a razor blade and a knife. Following Doris's murder, newspapers, who until now had hardly covered the murders, dubbed the killer the Blackout Ripper. This name was in reference to the similarities between his killings and those of Jack the Ripper's, but also pointed to the fact that he used the blackouts of World War II to his advantage. Following this, the murders became headline news nationwide. On Friday the 13th, Margaret Hayward, who also went by Greta Hayward, was attacked in a doorway near Piccadilly Circus. Margaret and her attacker had crossed paths earlier that evening. The young man, who had been described as being well-spoken, offered Margaret £30, which would be roughly £1,000 today. However, Margaret told him she wasn't that type of girl. Nevertheless, she accompanied the man into the streets, and the pair began walking in the direction of Haymarket. This is when the man became aggressive towards her and pushed her into a doorway and began groping her waist. The man attempted to persuade Margaret to go into an air raid shelter with him, however she declined, which infuriated him. Her attacker began aggressively fondling Margaret before strangling her into unconsciousness after she tried to escape his clutches. The unknown man was rifling through Margaret's handbag when a delivery boy, delivering milk to the nearby pub, interrupted him, forcing the man to flee the scene. When the delivery boy, John Shine, reached Margaret, she had regained consciousness, and he accompanied her to the local police station to provide eyewitness testimonies before Margaret was escorted to the hospital by a police officer. In his hurry to flee the scene, Margaret's attacker left behind his RAF-issued gas mask and haversack, which John had recovered from the doorway and handed to investigators. Detective Sergeant Thomas Shepherd noted the RAF regimental number 525987 inside the haversack and immediately contacted the RAF police in order to identify the owner of the items. This led to the identification of Gordon Frederick Cummins. Gordon Frederick Cummins was born on the 18th of February 1914 in North Yorkshire to John, a civil servant, and Amelia, a housewife. He attended a private school in South Wales and obtained a diploma in chemistry when he was 16 years old. When he was 18, Gordon moved to Newcastle, where he worked as an industrial chemist for 5 months, before getting a job as a tanner in Northampton. He was fired from this job after 13 months for poor timekeeping, and after several part-time jobs, he moved to London in October 1934. In London, Gordon got a job as a leather dresser in a clothing factory, and on the side, he developed a desire to live the life of an aristocrat. He insisted on being called the Honourable Gordon Cummins, engaged in theft and embezzlement to keep up his financial facade, and often bragged to colleagues about sexual encounters he'd had with women. In February 1935, he was fired from his job and moved in with his brother. From there, Gordon enlisted as a volunteer in the RAF in Regent's Park and initially trained as a rigger. Gordon was relocated several times with the RAF, starting out in Suffolk, moving to Scotland, then Dunbartonshire, Wiltshire and Cornwall. In January 1942, having racked up 1,000 hours of flying experience, Gordon undertook an aviation exam, which earned him a transfer to the Aircrew Receiving Centre in Regent's Park. Gordon would be stationed there with 300 men and was ordered to report for duty at 10 a.m. on the 2nd of February. Gordon was questioned in connection with the Blackout Ripper murders on the 14th of February, where he was described as being evasive and arrogant. He vehemently denied any involvement and provided seemingly solid alibis for each of the nights in question. Following Gordon's claim of innocence, he was arrested and held on remand. Sign-in sheets at Gordon's living quarters appeared to corroborate his claims, suggesting he had returned hours before each of the murders. However, this seemingly solid alibi quickly unravelled, as investigators discovered that Gordon's fellow airmen would often vouch for each other's return to the base, and on the nights in question, Gordon and a fellow airman had snuck out of their quarters at midnight via a fire escape. To further prove his guilt, items taken from the crime scenes were discovered in Gordon's possession, including a white cigarette case belonging to Evelyn Oatley and a picture of her mother. Fingerprints found on the tin opener near Evelyn's body were also a match to Gordon. Margaret Hayward and Catherine Mulcahy were asked to observe a police lineup in order to identify their attacker. Whilst Catherine was unable to positively identify him, Margaret Hayward was certain that Gordon Cummins was the man who attacked her in the doorway just days earlier. On the 16th of February, Gordon was charged with the murders of Evelyn Oatley, Margaret Lowe, and Doris Joannou. On the 20th of February, he was further charged with assaulting Margaret Hayward and Catherine Mulcahy. On the 27th of March, he was charged with the murder of Evelyn Hamilton. Gordon Cummins' trial began on the 27th of April 1942 at the Old Bailey. Gordon, who was described by a local newspaper as, quote, clean-shaven, with brown, wavy hair, brushed well back, end quote, was witnessed light-heartedly talking to his lawyers and smiling at his wife, who believed he was innocent. The first witness to take the stand was Detective Chief Superintendent Frederick Cherrell, He was adamant that the fingerprints found at the crime scene of Evelyn Oatley's murder belonged to Gordon, with John Flowers, for the defence, contending that the print was too faint to conclude it belonged to Gordon. Next to take the stand was Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who had performed Evelyn's autopsy. He testified that Evelyn's cause of death was a deep cut to her throat and that she would have bled out in less than 5 minutes. Furthermore, he told the court that Evelyn's death would have occurred at roughly 12:30 a.m, however stated it could have actually occurred up to 2 hours before or after. Fellow airman Felix Sampson was next to take the stand. He testified that on the night of Evelyn's murder, he and Gordon had solicited 2 sex workers sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m, just outside the Monaco restaurant in Piccadilly Circus, and had agreed to meet back outside the restaurant after using the sex workers' services. Felix arrived back at the restaurant at roughly 11:30 and waited 25 minutes for Gordon before wandering off to a local pub. He arrived back at their living quarters at 6 a.m. and found Gordon fast asleep. When he later asked Gordon what time he returned, he told him sometime between 3:30 a.m. and 4 a.m, and that, quote, "the woman I went with didn't satisfy me, so I went and found someone else," end quote. Gordon was the next and final person to take the stand in his own defence. While he admitted to being in Evelyn's company before her death, he insisted he had no involvement in it and that he had been with a different sex worker afterwards, and claimed that Evelyn had been very much alive when he left her. The prosecution and defence presented their closing arguments just the following day, on the 28th of April, and the judge presiding over the case, Mr. Justice Asquith, gave his final instructions to the jury. While summing up the case, he stated, quote, "A sadistic sexual murder has been committed here of a ghoulish and horrible type, but of a type which is not at all uncommon, and that has been done by somebody. What you have to determine is whether, upon the evidence, it has been proved beyond reasonable doubt that the murderer was the man who stands in the dock. His life and liberty are in your hands, but in your hands also are the interests of society," end quote. At 4 p.m. that day, the jury retired to consider their verdict, and just 35 minutes later, they returned. The jury found Gordon Cummins guilty of the murder of Evelyn Oatley, and Mr. Justice Asquith sentenced him to death. Quote, "Gordon Frederick Cummins, after a fair trial, you have been found guilty, and on a charge of murder. As you know, there is only one sentence which the law permits me to pronounce, and that is you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and that you there be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy on your soul," end quote. Gordon was sent to Wandsworth Prison to await his execution, and after a rejected appeal, Gordon Cummins was executed by Albert Pierrepoint on the 25th of June 1942. While Gordon was only ever tried and convicted for Evelyn Oatley's murder, Scotland Yard are certain he also murdered Evelyn Hamilton, Margaret Lowe, and Doris Joannou. The Blackouts were a nationwide effort to turn all lights off in towns and cities across Britain, devised so that German bombers could not be guided by the light. Households were given dark cotton fabric to cover their windows, car headlamps were blacked out, and cigarettes and cigars were not allowed to be smoked outside. Whilst this was all in an effort to reduce the number of bombings Britain experienced, it allowed a remorseless, brutal killer to go on a vicious killing spree. It allowed 4 lives to be claimed, and 2 others to be maimed forever. The murders of Gordon Cummins have been likened to those of Jack the Ripper some 60 years earlier. However, occurring under the guise of the war, these victims have been forgotten, and the infamy and brutality of the murders has never been realised. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to head over to Apple Podcasts to leave a rating and review, and Patreon to consider becoming a patron of Murder and More. As a patron, for just $2 a month, you get access to episodes early and ad-free, and you get a sticker sent to you. The link to my Patreon can be found in my show notes. To interact with us, you can follow us on Twitter and Tumblr at Murder and More, Instagram at Murder and More Pod, and Facebook at Murder and More Podcast. To view the sources and pictures for this episode, head over to www.murderandmorepodcast.wordpress.com. Have an amazing few weeks, stay safe, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks for another episode.
Hey everyone, you're invited to Harpy Hour! I'm Tracy. I'm Liz. I'm Steph. We are the Harpies, and Harpy Hour is our new podcast featuring ridiculous stories in history, science, and entertainment.
Were you ever suspicious that pigeons were secretly spying on you?
How do you know who to eat first if you survive a shipwreck? Do problematic musicals send you into an uncontrollable rage?
If so, then Harpy Hour might be your new favorite podcast. That's HARPY for Harpy, and new episodes air every Tuesday wherever you listen to podcasts.
You can also find us on all social media at Harpy Hour Pod.
And check us out on harpyhourpodcast.com.
Okay, bye!